Astralis are the best team in the world. They're the reigning major champions. They've won 3 of the last 4 big international tournaments. They've delivered success to what was otherwise destined to become one of the great what-if cores of Dupree, Device, and Zipniks, who obviously were very great back in 2015 and were always elite contenders since 2014, but had never won the big one, never won a 250k more or 550k or more prize pool tournament. And yet the way that people respond to Astralis' victories and the way that people in general seem to treat them actually would rank them as one of the most seemingly disliked championship teams we've had in a long time in Counter-Strike. I mean, they're actually, in this sense, hence the title of the video, quite reminiscent of FNATIC 2015, probably the greatest lineup in the history of CSGO. So, the reason why I say that, the context, is that now that FNATIC won all those titles, now that we're years removed from then, and now that FNATIC aren't that same level of elite team anymore, people look back fondly on the FNATIC era and they go, oh, wasn't it great? And wasn't that an amazing team? And of course, Olof Meister was the best player. And of course, they were going to win all those majors and all those titles. But the funny thing is, it wasn't like that at the time. That's not the way people talked and the way people thought about that team during the meat of their run as the best team in the world. When FNATIC won those big tournaments and won those big matches, the respect they got was almost begrudging. It wasn't like a celebration of how fantastic they were and how good they were. It was almost as though like, oh, well, I guess they're the best then, or, well, they won this one, like, okay, I guess they played a better game there, I guess that player's better. And it's similar for Astralis. I mean, even other pros seem to look at Astralis, some of them, and don't really give them their due and kind of say like, oh, well, I guess they're the best, or you have to call them the world number one. But they do it in a way where they want Virtus.pro to beat them, or they want Na'Vi to win this game, or they want FaZe to come through and do it. And they have all these other teams, or SK, all these other teams where they're the players, the fans' favourites among them, even or the players' favourites, as it were. And Astralis seem to be the ones that even the players don't really want to win the title. I mean, FNATIC, if you remember, were actually, by they got into the middle portion of their careers, they were actually booed. They were actually like, they never had a home crowd. Now, it's not quite as bad for Astralis, but they don't really get a massive crowd reaction. They got one when they were at the major because it was an NA crowd, so they were fairly neutral because obviously no NA teams left by the time you got to the playoffs of a major. But they certainly weren't as raucous as the VP crowd. They weren't as big as some of those Na'Vi crowds I've seen when you go to Eastern Europe. Obviously, they were nowhere near if NIP plays in Sweden. Well, obviously, similar thing for FNATIC, right? FNATIC, when they were the best team in the world at DreamHack Winter 2014, weren't even cheered because NIP was the team that people cheered for instead. Obviously, when we're talking about the guys from FNATIC not also getting the respect of the players, if you remember, DreamHack Winter 2014, the other teams hated FNATIC then, admittedly because some of them thought they were cheating. Famously, the Hellraisers guys wouldn't even shake FNATIC's hand when they came over to see them. We all know famously the story of Cloud9 and some of their players basically dissing FNATIC at a later event, in ESEA LAN, I think it was. So beyond that, you see the context and the way that people characterize FNATIC's success in how they talk about Astralis in the future, Astralis rather, and how they talk about in the future, and how this has some parity to what happened to FNATIC. So when people talk about Astralis going forwards, this team that's won 3 of the last 4 events, won the major, they have this amazing record in terms of the map pool depth, and some of the maps are the best in the world on. People look at them and they go, the major, they were lucky, they were just lucky to win that there. Remember, 92% of pick'ems had Na'Vi beating Astralis in the quarterfinals. They think that VP should have beaten them in the final when they were up 13-7 on the last map on Train. Likewise, thanks to VP now beating them in Vegas, people think, but if VP play them, VP's going to beat them each time. VP's more mentally strong. They want to say Astralis only won those tournaments because it was an easier era, and you know what, FNATIC hasn't got rolling yet, G2's not got rolling, FaZe only just got Nico, like the new batch of teams, all these new elite teams, SK with Phelps. These teams, whichever one it takes, they'll displace Astralis, they'll oust them as the number 1 team. Well, here's the thing. Again, people now look back with their fan brain and go, oh, well, everything that happened was always going to happen. Funny, they don't think, oh, Astralis win the major. But every tournament pass, of course, that team was the best one. And of course, they must have been better if they won the game. Well, now everyone looks back. And yeah, they can easily acknowledge FNATIC were the best team. Probably the best team to ever play the game. Back in 2015, late 2014, when they began their run. But meat of it was obviously 2015. But that's the funny thing, is that I was there and the context was absolutely not that FNATIC were clear number ones and were going to win every tournament and they were going to win the next tournament. People constantly tried to find a way to do the mental gymnastics to come up with a reason why FNATIC wasn't going to win the next tournaments and why they were good, but now this other team was going to overtake them. So first of all, when FNATIC first rose up, they were vying with the LDLC team, which later became Envious, for who was going to be number one. And obviously FNATIC did it first of all, because FNATIC won 3 tournaments in a row, and 2 of them, they beat the Envious guys in the final. Then, sure, Envious got the forfeit win, they got the walkover win at the major, and actually, the way the map was playing out, it looked like they would have won anyway, but obviously it's very contentious, the whole overpass boost. I've actually made a whole video about this topic. It's not as simple as people think of, like they were going to win, because of the nature of what boost was illegal and who did what illegal boosts. But after that, the key thing was, the sentiment around the FNATIC guys, obviously was, oh, Envious should have beaten you anyway, LDLC at the time, should have beaten you anyway, like, they're obviously a very good team, and so all the people who didn't want FNATIC to be the best, some of them were like, oh, well, LDLC, Envy's going to be the best now, and what helped that was the next 2 tournaments after that, well, no, and obviously LDLC won that major, but then actually the next tournament LDLC went to, they won that as well, and that was a tournament FNATIC was at. It was MLG X Games Aspen. And so when LDLC won that, and then became Envious afterwards, some people wanted to be like, right, they're going to be the best team now, they're number one now, FNATIC had their time. In fact, at the time, people even said FNATIC was the number one, but they lost at the major, so who knows, maybe they choke at majors, maybe they just can't win a major in that sense, whereas obviously LDLC had just won one. People said this. Now, looking beyond that, yeah, Envious still won some tournaments and still a top 4 team, but it's laughable what they won in comparison to FNATIC going beyond that. That's why it's the FNATIC era and not what at the time it looked like it might be, a dual kind of shared FNATIC Envious era. Then there was NIP, because remember, at that same major, DreamHack Winner 2014, FNATIC forfeits, goes out in the round of 8 to LDLC. NIP goes on this miraculous run. First event where they had Makalele. They get to the final. They lose the deciding map of the final, Overpass, in overtime after actually being at championship point in regulation. They lose narrowly. Then they go to MLGX Games Aspen. And at this tournament, they play FNATIC in the semi-finals. And they beat FNATIC in probably the best series ever played. Admittedly, Flusher seemed unusually bad in that one compared to his normal pretty good level. But NIP beat them in that one. They went to the final. They lost to LDLC again, but then again, it was a randomized Cobblestone pick for the decider, and that was before Cobblestone had been reworked. So people looked at that and they were like, NIP can beat FNATIC when they play them now. They're the better team than them. With Makalele, maybe they can be the new number 1 team. This was a real thing being pushed, obviously by the NIP fan base, but by other people too, because NIP was a very exciting style of team. Absolutely they were. Then, obviously, NIP kicked out Makalele, but they got in Alu. And sure, FNATIC had won Pantamera, but they'd won it in interesting fashion because they'd lost a map to Titan, and then in the final, they'd narrowly beaten Titan on a map, and there was still the back and forth of who was the best. Then Katowice comes around, NIP with Alu, smash Envious in the semis. So there's one potential contender out the way. They get to the final and narrowly lose a pretty close final to FNATIC. So again, people are like, you know what? FNATIC got unlucky. NIP got unlucky there. They're going to beat FNATIC next time. NIP can be number 1. Okay, eventually that obviously went away because NIP won fuck all after that, whereas FNATIC was winning everything. So what happens then? Did everyone get on board and say, yep, FNATIC's going to be the best, FNATIC's going to be the greatest team in history, and let's expect them to win more? No, because a few months after that, in came TSM, the Danes, the guys who are now Astralis, and they were beating FNATIC in most of the first series they were playing, and they were winning 3 events as a result of it. They won CCS, PGL kickoff, championship kickoff season, or whatever it was called. They won Face It Stage 1. They won Fragbite Masters Season 4. At this point in time, they'd beaten FNATIC a bunch. People weren't just saying, right, TSM's the counter to FNATIC, which is the logical explanation, or a good contender with FNATIC. People were like, no, you have to call TSM the number 1 team in the world now. TSM themselves even said it. And people were like, right, FNATIC's era's ended. Obviously, after that, by the way, guys, FNATIC would only go on and win another major and win more tournaments overall than the guys from TSM. So that didn't work out again. Then as soon as Envious did the French shuffle and they got in Kenny S and Apex and they started doing well at a couple of tournaments, oh, you know what? It's time for Envious 2.0. It's their era, boys. They got to the final of Cologne. The two teams played. FNATIC beat them again. Now, obviously, after that, Envious did take over as the world number one. But you see how many contenders came along that vied with FNATIC and battled with FNATIC, but ultimately one team kept prevailing, one team kept winning, one team kept rising up to the number one spot, if not maintaining it, dropping down and instantly coming back. And yet every time people were like, they're done now, they were lucky in that last game, it's over for them, this new team's the truth, and people did everything they could to find a way not to acknowledge that FNATIC was going to be the best. Now, why is it that people want to write off FNATIC and want to write off Astralis and don't seem to particularly like them? So with FNATIC, there's a lot of historical context as to why that is. Like, first of all, for JW and Flusher, it goes back to the infamous NIP handshake incident at Bucharest, DreamHack Bucharest 2013, which was in the autumn of 2013, where famously they had this game that went into overtime and the rules were confused between the teams. And then even though FNATIC won, the team, which had Muddy as the leader at the time, was talking shit and they were a bit feisty with NIP. And so NIP was the most popular team at the time. So everyone hated FNATIC from then on. Now, obviously, only 2 players remained from that lineup. Like, Olafmeister and Crims weren't there. Prolux wasn't even in the fucking team. But people still held that grudge, the NIP fans, obviously. So that's why in the Swedish scene, there was always like a kind of a sentiment of discontent around FNATIC that they didn't want these as their representatives and champions. They wanted NIP. Then you had, going into DreamHack 2014, all the Flusher clips, all those clips that people said were aim locks and that he was cheating and that he was wall hacking and all the rest of it, and possibly using an aimbot. If you remember, there was that clip from Cologne that everyone went nuts over. So that already made people question them as a team. And then as a result, even pros were questioning them and were kind of like, oh, this is bullshit, what's going on? Then at that very major, you have the Olaf overpass boost where people feel like the FNATIC team had robbed LDLC of the victory. Now, I don't think that's the case. I think it should have been replayed. But you can see in the moment, the heat of the moment, why with all this other context in the background, that seemed like something that people targeted in on was the lightning rod, and then FNATIC got all the hatred in the community. Then you've got to consider that, as I mentioned, some of these people they beat, but the key thing is that the FNATIC guys beat everyone. And so in beating everyone, they would routinely beat the real fan favourites. So the real fan favourites were like Virtus.pro, always a fantastic team. Always took FNATIC close, but FNATIC always got the best of them. So everyone was like, oh, this is bullshit, my favourite team's losing. NIP. Overall, they got the better of NIP. They would beat out the Ninjas, and yet Ninjas, fantastically popular team. Na'Vi, okay, at that point in time, Na'Vi didn't win many tournaments, but Na'Vi have always been loved for their style of play. People have always loved the flair of Guardian. People actually wanted them. They were an underdog that people wanted to break through FNATIC and win, but obviously Na'Vi never did it in best of 3 series. So let's look at Astralis then. So kind of tying on to that point about Na'Vi there, you would think Astralis would be loved for having been a team that were up there and could have won, but never managed to, like a Na'Vi, like a VP during times when they didn't win, but was still very competitive. You'd think, right, that Astralis would have that kind of vibe around them, right, and people would be happy they finally won. But that's the problem. When a VP took FNATIC close and just got edged out, they brought everything out of themselves. They played like absolute men. They played a fantastic game, but FNATIC could still outdo them. When Na'Vi lost, Na'Vi famously, they'd still get to 9-10 rounds on every map. They'd still play really competitive games. They'd still execute their style and have themselves in with a chance, but then lose to FNATIC. So it felt like at least they gave a good representation of themselves. They didn't let down the fans. They gave it a great shot. They tried their hardest, but they just didn't win. Because the guys from Astralis used to lose in the same kind of position in the tournament, but due to breakdowns themselves and mental breakdowns themselves and not showing up to compete with opponents and choking, people didn't like that. People don't want to get behind that and be fans of people like that, unfortunately. I think actually there's a degree to which it disgusted people. I mean, there's a reason why I almost used to feel like a masochist when I would pick them to win some of these huge games, like the MLG quarter semi-final against Na'Vi, because on paper, they should have won it. They had the right map draw for it. They had the right team to do it. They had the right style to do it. So then when they go ahead and lose and they do choke it up like that, yeah, you do feel like, oh, fuck, why ever? Even though it made sense, how can I ever pick for these guys? I mean, I remember a famous pro, I won't mention who, telling me after that famous, infamous breakdown at Cluj-Napoca where they lost to NIP in the round of 8, which should have been an easy game. They were smashing NIP before that, and should have been an easy route to the final. And they go out 5th to 8th. Total breakdown. I remember this bro telling me, listen, I know why you picked them, and I know on paper they should win. Never bet on those guys. They're so mentally weak. They're going to break down. Like, you just have to go ahead and bet against them. And funny thing is, he wasn't necessarily wrong, because they did lose to NIP in further matches where they were the better team, but they still lost to NIP. So I can see what he was saying at that point in time. I can see why people were really put off them even at that point in time. So now that they win, they haven't got that sentiment behind them where everyone really was heartbroken. Danish fans were sure, Astralis fans were sure, but the other fan bases didn't really give a fuck. In fact, they didn't see Astralis really as the same level as the Virtus.pros and Navis, even when those teams were all losing. Then you've got to consider that the style that Astralis uses is considered boring. I mean, it's not flashy. It's not built around one player going super ham or carrying, but it's more around the fundamentals of the game. It's more around making a good read. It's more about executing the same thing 4 out of 5 rounds, but doing it to such a high level that it works, even though you know what's going to happen. The opponent knows what's coming, and you still make it work anyway. For whatever reason, people don't really enjoy that in terms of the casual fans and who just want to see headshots. That's not as fun for them as a crazy VP explode under the site strat that then comes into a Snacks 1v2 that he wins in ridiculous fact. That's not going to get them pumped as much as that. Or Forest 3 one-bullet headshots in a row, even though obviously there's skill in the Astralis team that can do these things. They're not relying on them as much. There's not that nip magic quality or the VP plow, etc., Virtus plow. There's not the same qualities in terms of what it takes for them to win. So people see them win in kind of this machine-like fashion, and they think, that's boring. That's not like beautiful Counter-Strike, you know. I mean, it is to me, because I personally, I enjoy the nuance of that and the technical ability it takes to be able to pull that off and the intelligence behind it. But I can understand why it's not the big fireworks style champagne Counter-Strike that people really want to see, that thrills them to the same degree, and as a result they don't have the same kind of fan base behind them when they win. I think people find their wins not as exciting. Now when they lose can be very exciting because they lose such close games, but when they win, people often see them win in kind of a dominant machine-like fashion and they think, this is boring. So I can understand that. There's also the fact that even though Astralis wins, their star player, Device, still chokes sometimes. So people still feel like, but if your star player chokes, do you really deserve that win? Or does this guy who's choked deserve to win? Now, there's a very complicated and nuanced argument about that, which is that oftentimes he carries earlier in tournaments to get them to the position where other people help him out and they win. And he used to carry so hard in 2016 while his whole team bombed around him that he almost deserves a bit of payback here of being allowed to win. I mean, it reminds me of like a Peyton Manning scenario where it's like, yeah, he did get carried in that last Super Bowl final, but you know what? He spent so many fucking years with no defense where he was just carrying the offense and they used to lose that, like, you know what? I think he deserves one at that point in time to be able to get a championship where he probably could have had a championship on some of the other years. So I can get why on a very base level people don't like that. But then you've got to consider as well, just like FNATIC, they also beat the fan favourites. They beat Virtus.pro, they beat Navi, they beat NIP. People don't like it when the fan favourites lose in that sense. Now, as a small factor, I certainly don't attribute this as a large factor, but I think for some fans, particularly the very vocal fans, the ones that are on Twitter, that are on HLTV.org, that are on Reddit, I do think for these sorts of fans who have a very cliquish way of thinking, that the fact that I was one of the first and was very early to pick both of these teams as the world number one, the next great team, the team that I expected to win all the following tournaments, I think that actually did rub people the wrong way, because people then think that if the team wins, somehow that's associated with me winning or me thinking that I'm right. And so if there's any way that it can rationalize why a VP or an SK or a FNATIC can be better, then they want to do that. And they want to think that other team's going to be better instead. Because, I mean, when FNATIC won their first big event with that lineup, so it was Face It Stage 2, that's actually when I already started talking about like the potential for this to be the FNATIC era. I did a video about it. I'll link it up here. Then Astralis, I actually did my tweet saying they would win the major. Literally right after, it was while I was sat on the desk, they had lost the E-League Season 2 finals. Because I saw enough, even in that loss, to be like, I think this team actually has all the factors going for them to be the best, to be the most likely to win when the major comes around. And I don't see which team's actually going to be able to beat them out. I mean, I actually did have Virtus.pro, you might have seen in some of the Counterpoints episode, as the most likely team to be able to beat them, but I still picked Astralis. So the fact that I was early on, people, for obvious reasons, because of how I created this persona, is very polarizing. People who don't like me don't want me to be right. So it's even more satisfying for them if Astralis aren't the best. And if Astralis are the best, if they go too hard with all the praise in some indirect way, might be praising me. I don't necessarily say that, but they certainly think that way, and they get mad triggered as a result. Then you got the fact that, I mean, as a last point, I would say that to some people, the tone of the Astralis players rubs players the wrong way, because the problem is, I mean, it's funny that people like Swedish players so much, because aside from like Forrest with his eyebrows and like Get Right with his wacky English, and Freiberg, I guess, did some of his jokes, a lot of the NIP players and a lot of the Swedish players are fairly boring. Like, they're not so expressive. They're not so great in general at winning people over with like pure charisma in the way that some of the VP players are. But it's particularly bad with the Danes, I've noticed. Like, for some reason, it's funny. If you ever get them outside of a CS setting, you talk to them privately, they actually have some of the best banter, some of the best humour, in as much as I think Danish culture has a similarity to British culture. They're very different from Swedish culture, which is very uptight and quite PC and quite reserved. But the problem is, on camera and in tweets, a lot of the Danish players, with the exception of maybe Dupree and Carrigan, don't really come off so well in terms of like seeming like very likable individuals or very charismatic, etc. People think they're a bit boring as people, or people think that if they express any kind of banter, so that they're cocky, that's how it's taken instead. So I can see why some fans wouldn't key in on that. They have to understand, though, those fans, that is entirely subjective perception on your part. That's not coming from the players. I mean, the idea that someone can think Taz is the most respectful, wonderful guy ever who never disrespects opponents. Well, no, he's done some things that were respectful. And if you like him as a fan, you're going to find a way to interpret everything as respectful. He's also done many, many disrespectful things throughout his whole career. Not overwhelmingly, but he's done some quite key ones that were pretty BM. But you know what? The rest of us just go, okay, there's different sides to the scales, right? Sometimes like this, sometimes like the other. But people will choose what to selectively ignore and what to focus in on, depending on if they like or don't like the player. And that's certainly a factor, I think, for Astralis. But like I've always said, and this applies for Astralis now, it actually doesn't matter if people like you. It doesn't matter if people hate you. Because ultimately, if you win enough and you are successful enough and you silence them enough times and you beat their team enough times, eventually they have to give you praise. They have to give you credit. And you will become like FNATIC 2015. Eventually, people will just look back and go, yeah, obviously FNATIC, Astralis was the best team there. And yeah, they did beat all the other teams. And they did have the most top placings. Eventually, they just have to say it because they don't want to be wrong for years and years to come. So they'll be wrong for a while until their brain just forces them to accept it to some degree. Then you got to add in the fact that who cares if they like you or not? If you get the trophies, if you're the last one standing, if you did beat all those other guys, and those other guys eventually in their brain have to understand that you defeated them. So it's like I've always said, boos don't block bullets. So just go out there, collect all the trophies, let everyone else be the fan favorite. Let them be the one that gets shit for, as long as you win at the end. Because the thing about Astralis is they're a fantastic team. I mean, people at the moment, I've noticed who don't like them, will just cite when they have a loss, and they will ignore the fact that they have dominant maps where they're unreal how dominant they are in some of these maps. There's very few teams can match up to what they're doing overall. To me, they're already a legendary team. I mean, this little spurt of winning now, winning the major, this is already big stuff. They're only, in theory, going to grow from here, though. They can win more titles. They can have more top placings. They can climb up that top teams of all time list. And maybe one day, they're far from doing it at the moment, maybe one day they can contend to be the number one team of all time. Because this is a team that shows no signs of stopping winning now, of stopping making deep runs. And ultimately, they're going to win more. This is to me, whether they're loved or not, this is like a thinking man's team. And so there's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of subtlety there. They don't have a lot of the flash and a lot of the natural charisma of the other teams, but they're fantastic at Counter-Strike.